Good afternoon to those joining us from the UK and across Europe. Good evening to those that are still with us in Asia, and good morning to those joining us from North America, Canada, and the US. I'm Maurice Evan-Buff, and I'm the CEO of Armstrong Wolf. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar, which is recited on day 3, the final day of our annual 3-day Conduct and Culture Summit. 221 was titled Purpose Over Profit. Over the 3 days, we've had a wonderful collection of informed voices, both COOs from the broader community, CEOs, heads of business, and informed professional voices, of which today is going to be a panel along that line. I think today's session is going to be particularly interesting because it bridges a number of sessions where we may have looked specifically at behavioral science, or we may have looked at evolving technologies, an additional tool for the COO community and their peers to help drive the agenda around culture and purpose. And then we also have the mainstay, the flagpole of which we've hung this 3 days on, which is purpose itself. It's going to be a very interesting and engaging conversation. I'm looking forward to actually having 2 ears and 1 mouth and using that proportion in this session. And I'm going to start off by doing some roundtable introductions. First of all, to Rupert. Known Rupert for a number of years now, both from the current capacity, and he's been tremendously supportive of my company's efforts in the last 3 or 4 years, and continually been an informed view on the evolving world of the Chief Control Officer. Rupert.
Thank you, Maurice. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We're hoping that we'll have an interesting conversation with you around technology, which is targeted at the behavioural science space. Back to you, Maurice.
Thank you, Rupert. Maya. Do we have you, Maria?
Yeah, sorry, Maurice. Good day to you all. My name is Mireille Rijmakers, and I'm the head of behavioral risk management at ING.
Thank you, Peter.
So, good morning and good day to all of you. My name is Peter Gloor. I'm the Chief Creative Officer of Galaxy Advisors and the research scientist at MIT, and absolutely delighted to be here.
Thank you very much, Peter. Harry, I'm going to introduce you, and then I'm going to also hand the baton to you to actually take us into the first phase of the hour.
Thank you very much, Maurice. So thank you for the introduction, Maurice, and hopefully people can see my presentation now. My presentation is focusing on how this field, this emerging field called behavioural data science, can help us better understand and influence and improve culture, behaviour, and of course, purpose. So I guess the way you could start contextualising this is to say that the way organisations measure, understand, and improve behaviour is changing, because the traditional approach has been using surveys, interviews, and expert observation and so forth. And that's absolutely fine and absolutely valid. But a number of organisations are now also complementing that with behavioural data science. And the way we interpret behavioural data science is a combination of psychology, artificial intelligence, and social network analysis. So what I'll be showing you today is a little bit of an explanation of what's happening in this field of behavioural data science. And in doing so, a starting point, I guess, is really, what are the features of this field of behavioural data science? Well, the first thing it does is it can provide real-time analysis of behavioural data, because it's constantly analysing data in the organisation. It can also scale really well. Some techniques we use to understand behaviour, like expert observation or interviews, aren't easy to scale very highly. But when it comes to AI and data science, from one person to hundreds of thousands of people. It can also complement people's opinion. So one of the main reasons we see this technology used is because surveys tell us what people think. This sort of technology helps us understand and observe what people do. And as we all know, what I say is not always what I do. And so therefore, this type of technology can give us a different lens on behaviour in the organisation. And we often see what is being said in surveys not necessarily playing out in practical everyday behaviour in the workplace. You can also, and this is one of the real powerful elements of this type of technology, you can uncover hidden patterns of communication in networks. Now, these networks are social networks, not the social network that you see in movies or on television, but these organizational networks of how people create relationships and how they interact in those relationships. It's often described as an X-ray of the organization because it goes below the hierarchical structure and the formal organizational structure and looks at how people interact on a day-to-day basis. And a lot of that can be hidden to the naked eye. Proactively identify behavioural hotspots and which allows for much faster interventions because a lot of this information is predictive. It looks forward and it looks ahead. So it really allows the user to get ahead of potential problems. And then finally, if used correctly, it really can help drive behavioural change in a much faster and a stickier way because you're actually looking at the way people interact on a daily basis, not just the formal organisational structure. And when you start influencing that daily interaction, the level of change you're making is absolutely granular, right at the root cause of behaviour. That's a few of the features that you see with this sort of technology. What I'd like to do now is quickly talk about, well, what does this technology do? What can you do with this type of technology? And this is a very broad structure. It's not by any means meant to be absolutely comprehensive, but it can give you an insight as to how this technology can be used. And the starting point is we can look at when people communicate. So, what free time I have can tell us something about how people are behaving, what connection time people have with their supervisors, their peers, and of course, what disconnect time that people have. Are they emailing a lot after hours? Or are they emailing a lot, in times when they should be doing other things? And it's not about monitoring and surveilling people. It's about understanding how this type of technology can help us to better improve people's collaboration, people's communication, and so forth. The other part of this, equation is the structure, who we communicate with. And this is where the social network structure really comes into its own. So you have people that are the go-to people in your social network at work. These are your direct connections, not necessarily who you report to, but who you tend to interact with on a regular basis. Then we also have people we call brokers. These are people that are very useful in bridging silos and connecting different people and different networks. So they're go-betweens or gatekeepers or brokers. And so if you've got a silo problem, if you've got teams that aren't collaborating very well, brokers can be a real help to addressing that. We also look at rotating leadership. These are people that move from the center of the network to the periphery of the network and then back into the center again. We've done some really interesting research here. And when I say we, Peter Glor has done this, this really interesting research in looking at how rotating leadership can really help us understand, for example, innovation. Teams much more likely to be innovative because when you've got leaders in these teams that are happy to give up some responsibility and allow new ideas to come into the environment, that can help produce better innovation. One of the ways we've used it from a risk management perspective is that, when you look at rotation, if you don't see any rotation at all, from a risk management perspective, could there be too much rigidity in that team? For example, are people controlling information too much and not being transparent enough, for example? Obviously, it all depends on the context. Individual reach is how far you can reach into other people. Community reach is how many communities or teams you can reach in the network, and network synergy is how your behavior in the network synergizes or entangles with behavior of others. Dynamics, and this is where it gets to be really interesting, where we start to see how the way technology is used can really start to give us an insight into how people are going to behave. So for example, the longer you take to respond to communication, all things being equal, potentially the less passion or interest you have in that communication subject matter. The more reminders you need to respond to people who communicate with you, all things being equal, the less respect you may have for those people. Because what we know is that if you're really passionate about something and you really respect somebody, when they write to you, they're on top of your response list, and when the subject matter hits your inbox, you want to address it. And I guess all this has to be contextualized. It doesn't mean that you have to constantly respond quickly to things. It all comes down to what matters and what's appropriate. Contribution index is your sending and receiving ratio. And this is a fascinating measure because it tells us not just what ratio of sending and receiving you have, but what contribution you're making to the conversation or the communication. So for example, if you're mainly receiving communication, but not contributing or sending communication, your contribution may not be optimum. And what we're looking for is a balance. Not too much sending because you could be spamming, not too much receiving because you could be just too passive in communication. I'll keep moving along just in the interest of time. Looking at content now, and this can range anything from basic sentiment analysis, positive, negative sentiment analysis, all the way through to personality profiling. Typically, in our case, we use the OCEAN traits: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And content is not obligatory because obviously there are always privacy issues to consider, but subject to those privacy issues, content can also be very, very interesting in terms of combining all these different measures together. And that brings me to my next point, and that is when you do combine these different types of categories together, schedule, structure, dynamics, and content, the predictive accuracy can really go very high. On their own, so for example, scheduling on their own may not be necessarily very high, but when you start to include structure and dynamics and even content, but even if it's just dynamics and structure, the accuracy can be very high. The type of data organizations typically analyze could be metadata and content, and again, because of privacy issues, content isn't always available, and that's okay, but metadata on its own can be fine too. Demographic data, incident data, transaction data. The list is almost endless, and in fact, any information the organization captures, these sorts of tools can analyze. If the organization can't capture that information, like WhatsApp and WeChat, obviously it can't be analyzed. But as long as the organization has that data, it can be included. And then the type of applications we can look at, decision making. These are the fundamental building blocks of behavior and culture, right? Learning behavior, leadership behavior, ownership, speaking up, collaboration, solo mentality, change resistance, and of course, sentiment and emotions. Now, you do need content to help you understand sentiment and emotions, but many of the other things I've pointed out can easily be done with just structure and dynamics on their own. And in fact, structure and dynamics can also give us some insight into sentiment and emotions, but obviously when you get to that level, content helps. And then what this all boils down to is, well, so what? Having all this level of analysis is great, all this insight is fantastic, but how does that help me? How does that help me improve my day-to-day objectives? And the answer is, one of the things that this thing really does well is it provides self-awareness. We call it the virtual mirror, where you can look at the data and get an understanding of how your behavior is impacting other people. Now, if it's your behavior as an individual, from our perspective, we keep that confidential. Only the individual herself or himself sees that data. And then beyond that, there can also be aggregated team level information, and that's where managers can use that team data to start running reflection sessions to discuss how the team's behavior could be impacting on other teams and so forth. But it all comes back to that self-awareness as a team or an individual. And then of course that enables the experts and the management to start planning interventions based on the data, provide actions, and then do some nudging as a follow-up to ingrain some habits. So there's sort of like a circle around how this can help drive behavioural change. And then the next question may be, well, okay, how would you go about applying this tool? And for the risk managers out there in the audience, it's very similar to key risk indicators, where you try to measure the root cause as opposed to the symptoms. So for example, you may have a goal of trying to achieve something in terms of behaviour. What we would look at is, well, what are the key drivers, the causal drivers of that objective or that goal? Then we would assign the signals, the measures of a tool like this, and then link it to outcomes. So here's a bit of a case study, and a typical one, of course, increasing accountability for risk management. You always see this when it comes to culture, behaviour in a risk context. And here are some drivers from our experience in dealing with many, many organisations that they've told us are relevant to accountability for risk management. For example, responsiveness, proactiveness, speaking up, advocacy and collaboration. And then what you would do is you would find the appropriate combination of signals. In our case, there are 35 to choose from these different categories. Some organisations or some vendors tend to sort of focus more on dynamics or structure, or some on content. I have to say though, it's when you combine all three that you really get a much more richer level of insight and accuracy in terms of your analysis. And finally, we always want to link that back to, well, what's it improving? What change is it affecting? And so some examples that we've been involved in is reducing unresolved risk issues, reducing level of non-compliance, reducing number of customer onboarding fails, and this is a really hot topic, improving collaboration across the 3 lines of defence. So this is an example of how you may go about calibrating technology like this. The key point here is that it goes to the root cause. And when you do that, you're predictive. What I'd like to do now is to just take you through some very simple case studies of how we used technology like this to indeed improve risk management accountability based on these different categories. So the first one I'm showing you now is response time. And it's not just responding for the sake of responding, okay? What you don't want to do is just say to people, you have to respond faster, because that just gets people more stressed. What you want to do is understand what is an appropriate response benchmark. And in this case, the team in question responded within 8 hours or so to operational people and sales people, but took a lot longer to respond to risk teams. And there was a disconnect. So the idea wasn't just go and respond faster, but why aren't you responding as fast to risk teams as you are to other teams? Is it because the risk team doesn't give you clear and simple communication, and therefore you can't understand what response is needed? Or is there a little bit of apathy or lack of interest when it comes to risk issues? In this case, it was the latter, that there just wasn't enough interest when it came to risk issues. And what you see here over a 3-month period or so, that the response time came down when it came to the risk team. What it did, it came down to the average level that they use to respond to other teams as well. And what that allowed us to do was to address the outstanding risk issues around 64% faster. The next one I'd like to show you is the contribution ratio. So we spoke about sending and receiving. Now, just quickly, the 0 here is actually the optimum position to be, because it's a balance between sending and receiving. If you're really high in sending, you're either spamming people or maybe you haven't got the right distribution list. But too much sending isn't a good thing either, because really you should be only using email when you have something to say. Otherwise, people will just think that you're wasting their time when they see emails from you. And of course, if you're mainly receiving, which is the negative score, then maybe you're not being engaged enough. And what we saw here was that there was a significant improvement. I mean, by improvement, we mean going to around a balance of sending and receiving. And you might think, well, this is interesting, but I wonder if it's really effective. We used this for a very famous case study, which was published in the Harvard Business Review, to look at when people could also be leaving the organization. What we found was that when people were disengaging from the organization, they started to become more on the receiving end rather than the balanced end. And it was a very interesting digital breadcrumb which showed us people's change of behavior even 5 months in advance in this case. You know, their use of technology and their communication patterns changed well before they even decided to leave the organization. And that's how we saw it through this sending and receiving ratio. Now, this next one here I'd like to show you is a very simplistic sentiment analysis. Positive sentiment versus negative sentiment. And what you see here is a predominance of positive sentiment. And that may be okay, I guess, if you're thinking about, you know, people happy or satisfied. What we were looking for here is really people prepared to speak up, people prepared to escalate bad news. And when we saw so much skewness towards positive sentiment, something was not right. Because what we're looking for, what we call honest language, which is a balance of positive and negative sentiment. Because if all you communicate is positive sentiment, where's the honesty? Where's the escalation of bad news? And when we drilled down deeper in this case, we found that junior people were more inclined to share bad news, but middle management was much more inclined to spin communication into a positive context. And so this really helped us sort of understand what was positive, what was negative, and what was the right balance. And we call that honest language. And then finally, just to sort of wrap up from my end, what you see here are two teams. And this is one of the benefits of what we call social network analysis. And just a very, very small explanation of social network analysis. The bigger the node, the more interaction people have with that node. You could almost say the more influence that person can have. And the closer the nodes, the more they interact. And what you see here is a little bit of a chasm or a silo between these two teams. Excuse me. In this case, apologies, in this case, the green team is a risk team and the purple team is a sales team. And there was that chasm. And what we did over a 1.5 month period, we started analyzing the data. And what we saw was that once we started sharing the information and giving people the opportunity to understand how they could improve their interaction, the collaboration with these two teams dramatically improved significantly. Okay, now apologies for that little bit of a coughing thing at the end, but that's the end of my presentation. What I'd like to do now is to hand over to Rupert, who will take you through a panel discussion on how the panel members have used behavioural science and AI to help transform behaviour.
Thanks, Harry. A lot of food for thought there. So, as Morris indicated, I welcome Peter and Mariah to the table. We're going to have a conversation around, some of these issues and more in relation to the behavioural agenda across organisations. Maybe Peter, if I start with you, I think we know, and certainly it's my bitter experience of trying to predict human behaviour is not at all straightforward. So perhaps if you could give us, and given that you've been involved in this industry for a lot of your professional career, give us your insights in terms of how AI helps us to start accurately predicting and understanding behaviour, and AI that's targeted at unstructured data.
Yes, I have been studying the creativity or the behavior of swarms of large groups of people for 20 years now at MIT, coming from computer networks and going to human networks, which I find so much more fascinating. And the point is that I do not know myself. Humans do not know themselves. The computer is honest. The computer will give me a mirror of my behavior by measuring what my colleague Sandy Pentland calls the honest signals. That means how quickly I respond to Rupert is much more honest than if I tell you, I really like you, Rupert. I think you are a great guy. You are absolutely wonderful. And I'm smiling while I'm saying that. So you might actually look at my eyes and check whether I really mean what I say. And if you are good in reading body language, which you wouldn't be in the position you are without not being good in reading body language, you will see whether I mean what I say. But frequently, and particularly in Zoom, it's hard to see those subtle, little, honest signals. The computer does it. It uses AI. It looks at my eyes. It does my facial emotion recognition and then knows whether I mean what I say. And that's just my face. And what we have been studying for 20 years is email. Email is just there. It's free and it's easy to analyze. And aggregating whether I answer to Rupert's email in 5 minutes or in 5 days will tell how highly I regard you. And that's just one of the 35 signals that Harry mentioned. We have tried hundreds of them and have been throwing away. That's why it takes a very long time studying those sort of things. Once you know it, you say, oh, it's so obvious. It's clear that if I answer you faster, I appreciate you more. But it took us tons of trial and error. The same with rotating leadership that Harry also mentioned, which basically we looked at software developers and how they interact with each other. And what we found is, well, there was an interesting side result about you can either be creative or productive, but not both. Sometimes they are mutually exclusive. And again, you wouldn't know this. AI, the virtual mirror, observes me, and then it will tell me whether I'm doing those sort of things. And the reason why AI is so powerful, it's not just taking Rupert and Maria and Harry and Peter, but millions of others and aggregating it. And then I learned that from one of my customers, comparing the best against the rest. Because normally you know who is a super performer, you know that intuitively. And then by comparing that and aggregating it, it will tell Peter what he can change to become better himself. I could go on for hours, but I think I should now pass back the word.
Thanks, Peter. I see you're smiling. I'm a bit nervous now as to whether, what you really think about me. Given that explanation, Maria, could I perhaps switch to you? In your long professional and academic career, you've been looking at behaviours and behavioural science very closely. I guess one thing you and I have talked about is that really understanding habits of an organisation are important, and habits are hard to break. Mm-hmm. And habits often lead to undesirable business outcomes. So, the question for you is, based upon your experience in some of the organisations that you've worked for, how do you break through these habits and cultural barriers that have grown up over years and sometimes decades?
Yeah. Well, Rupert, the key word has already been mentioned. It's about awareness, right? Because habits are all about automated behaviors, things that we do that we're hardly aware of. And so we don't know. We don't know what we do. We don't know why we do it. So a very important step is that we become aware of actually what it is that we do. And just as Peter is saying, I mean, data observations are the most powerful, of course, for people to understand what is it actually what I'm doing. And then the second is, of course, that you want to know, well, why is it that you're doing that? What is it bringing you? In what way is it helping you? But also, I think what's really crucial is that the risk that organizations run come from behaviors that are not effective anymore, habits that are not effective anymore. At some point in time, you start to behave in a certain manner as an individual and as a group because it's a solution to a certain situation, and then at some point in time, it's no longer effective, or it can become a risk in the worst case. So being aware of what you're doing, being aware of how it's helping you or not, if it's exposing you to a risk or not, I think is crucial to break those habits. And these kind of tools we're talking about today are, of course, very much based and rooted in data. I think they have a more they're much more objective, of course, than if you work with self-reflective tools, which can also help, right? They can also help you become more aware, but I think these are very powerful. And so I think self-awareness is key. And another thing that you can also do, of course, is influence the triggers in people's working context that elicit certain behavior. But again, you have to know why people behave in a certain manner and what it is that they do. And if you have a good diagnosis in that sense, then you can start impacting it.
Thank you, Mariah. That's great. So, Peter, sort of taking up on Mariah's point, we've talked about technology being used to analyze behaviors and identify the set of behaviors that exist within an organization. How, if we get to, where the rubber hits the road, how can we use technology to sort of change the behaviors? What's its role? So moving from the analytics and sort of, the awareness piece into action. Have you got any insights there?
Well, I think Maria already mentioned both keywords, awareness and triggers. It's basically, and awareness from me is what I call virtual mirroring. You get a mirror of your own behavior, which makes you aware how well you compared to best practices. And that encourages you to change your behavior. The other thing that you can do as an organization to help your employees to change their behavior is, as Maria said, triggers, or as they are called in behavior economics, nudges. And now, personally, I favor awareness over nudges. Nudges to me is very close to manipulation, and I'd rather I'm under the illusion, I'm getting philosophical, of self-control. There is this entire school of philosophy that says there is no free will, really. We are always driven by the context. I'm not going there right now. That would be for another very long panel. But the nudges, to me, just smells a bit of too much manipulation. And sometimes it also doesn't work so well. So whether I get automatically deducted the money at the end of each month to save for my pension, or whether I get a statement every day or every month that tell me that my pension fund is really solid efficient and I should basically take action. That's the two approaches. One is the virtual mirror, the other one is the nudge. I think it needs both. It's really, but I'm always for transparency and for making people aware and trusting in the goodwill and in the intelligence of other people to take the right action. This doesn't mean that you cannot help with nudges, because we are all lazy people and we need to be kicked occasionally to actually do things. But the key thing is comparing the best against the rest and tell me how I do, and then encourage me to change my behavior.
Thanks, Peter. Mariah, could I come back to you on that point? From your experience, have you seen, sort of real life situations where the technology, apart from the analysis piece, has actually driven, the behavioural change that the organisation's been seeking?
Well, we haven't. I haven't been a direct user of the technology yet. I'm absolutely anticipating to become one, but I think in my what I've done in the time that I worked for the Dutch Central Bank, as well as what we're currently doing now, is that we're doing a very thorough diagnosis where we get a lot of data on how people behave, just not with the technology. And I'm very eager because it can make us very much more efficient, and you can scale up more easily. But having giving people information on how they behave as a group, what they do together, based on interviews, based on surveys, based on observations that we've done, but giving them that information, and then talking about what are the risks, what is the impact of those behaviors, and of course there's always good that happens, right? But there's in my experience, we always see risks that the organization runs just because of the way how people decide together, and how closely they inform and collaborate. So there's always and I see how powerful it is, and how it is also experienced as intrusive sometimes, but also in terms of, well, you need to create some kind of discomfort with people in order to create the desire to change things, to create movement. And focusing on behaviors of people and the impact of those behaviors, that is just a very powerful combination. So I absolutely expect when we start using this kind of technology, it will have that same impact.
You know, that's an interesting thread, and I'd like to come back to that. But perhaps if I could turn to Peter firstly, just to set the scene. Peter, certainly when I've looked at this technology and other technologies and thought about, you know, what techniques you can use in an organization to really get under the skin of, you know, the behavior set and understand how people are feeling, how they're engaging, how they're conducting themselves, etc. You know, inevitably the data privacy, you know, issues and people feeling that they're being unfairly monitored comes up. You know, we certainly saw, you know, those issues play out, you know, when surveillance technology was, you know, first deployed. I think most people would recognise in financial services, and particularly in, you know, particular business activity, that sales surveillance is part and parcel of, you know, the job. And it's just as natural as, you know, having to ask your manager for approval on something in another department. But what's been your experience in around the whole issue of, you know, resistance associated with data privacy and, you know, I guess the Big Brother oversight concern?
Well, that's the key question, Rupert. If we cannot resolve that, we are dead after 5 minutes. I learned that the hard way. I had been a partner at PwC and Deloitte until 2002. I came back to MIT. My former boss at MIT was the CTO of one of the largest high-tech companies in the US. He brought me in to do an email analysis. He thought it was a great idea. And he was inviting his leaders, and I was flying to California presenting it. And after 5 minutes, they told me, we are not going along with that. I'm sorry. We will just, if you do that, we will block you. And we will just start faking our emails so that you cannot supervise us. And so I was out. And I had a horrible month after that, very sad. I thought I had already my huge, big project lined up. I learned my lesson the very hard way. You have to respect individual privacy and give the management only aggregated information. And you have to very transparently inform everybody who is participating in that panel. They have to opt in, and then they can get their information. And the tool that we are using now, this is the latest version. I'm not sure how much you can see that. It shows me how I do. So it gives individual information to the individual in the privacy of my own phone. You can also have the privacy of your own browser, but we found that people, they are more used to the privacy of their own phone, and that works very well. And then the managerial dashboard, that will only show individual information if individuals opt in and agree. And it depends on the culture of the organization that they want to share if somebody else is not doing very well. We are never sharing any content, which means, and that's again the power of AI, we convert content into embeddings. That's basically a vector which has 1 million elements, which are just probabilities, numbers, which are impossible to read for a human. So that means even if, when we do email analysis, the organizations, the biggest fear they have is that their own internal email IT admin might have the chance to look at the archive, and then he will know all the secrets of the CEO. Well, with that approach, it's not possible, because it's all encrypted and it's an embedding. It's something that AI can use. It's a tensor. We are using something called TensorFlow, which is one of the things that Google gives us, which you also use for example, face recognition. But we use it for NLP, natural language processing, and it's totally anonymous, encrypted, and just a vector of numbers. And then Rupert gets Rupert's social landscape. But Peter doesn't know how Rupert's landscape look. Rupert might see that Peter respects him because he answers his emails quickly, but that's only extracted from the mailbox of Rupert. So it's information you have anyway, and if you so desired, you could export your own mailbox to Excel, and you could just look, if you know how to program an Excel macro, and you could see whether Maria or Peter answer Rupert any faster. So the key is that you are very transparent in what you do, and that you give the individual their own virtual mirror and not show that to management. I like to just briefly comment on something else that Maria said, where she said, you need to create discomfort. What I learned, no pain, no gain. That means it might be painful for Peter to see that sometimes he answers Rupert really slowly, or that Rupert doesn't takes like 3 days to answer me. But it will then kick me to change my behavior, to either reach out to see why our collaboration is not the way how it is, and then gain comes.
So thanks for that, Peter. I must admit the sort of irony of the senior leadership team not wanting to expose themselves to the technology is, somewhat interesting. Probably suggests that you don't need the technology at all. You've got your answer there. Maria, can I get your view in terms of the, these data privacy? I guess the more, the skepticism that exists within organizations around, behavioral analytics and some of the techniques that you've seen successful in terms of getting over that hurdle.
I think the individual privacy is very important with this technology, but we also see it in the work that we're doing with the extensive deep dives on behavioral risks in certain areas within ING. We don't focus on the individual level. We're being very transparent about this. We always want to understand, what is the group actually doing? What are the group habits? And so it's important to be transparent also about that and include that. And nevertheless, if you go to a senior leadership team, just in the example that Peter gave, and you have a discussion with them on the levels of trust that you see, and that it becomes up close and personal for everybody in that room, right? So talking about these behaviors, and especially in the context of how is this driving performance and where do we get exposed to risks, that is just in itself a discomforting conversation. And you don't need the individual level, so to speak. If you're talking about teams about these topics, they will experience it as up close and personal, and it makes it just it's important to be transparent about what it is you're looking for, what are the topics you're zooming in on, how you're going to work. But then you can, you have very powerful conversations, and still respect, of course, the individual privacy as well, and also have the individual, the impact on individual level, that people who are aware and are willing to take it on and go further will absolutely do that.
Thanks, Mariah. Peter, do you have any insights on this point?
How senior leadership can become more accepting of participating in the pilot, that's really hard. What I have found, and I shouldn't really say that because it might kill our business, the ones that like to work with us wouldn't really need us. Meaning you have to be open to change. And you would expect that this is a characteristic of senior leaders, but sadly, it's not that commonplace. And the ones that really like to be challenged and to embrace change, they like to work with us, and then they are very willing to experiment and try out those things themselves. And then we become an integral part of the organization, and we have done projects over decades. Another thing that I like a test to see how open an organization is, just go to the cafeteria. And if you see that groups of people are sitting at a table, if my host walks through the cafeteria and he greets left and right, then that's a very healthy organization. And if everybody is just devouring their food and so on, they will have a really hard time changing the culture. And I mean, our tools are great for raising awareness, but then you need to have the support from the top to actually help us to roll this out. And that can be a very long process. I mean, there is other things. It helps that we come from the ivory tower of MIT. That normally opens the door, and also having a background that bridges academia and industry, those are all things that help. But in the end, I think it's a willingness of senior management to also be open to those new things.
Thanks, Peter. We're getting a number of questions in from the audience, and thank you very much all for the contribution. One question I'd like to jump on is, and I'll read it to ensure that I'm faithful to the subject. Do you consider that emerging technologies in behavioural science will replace the present reliance on surveillance technologies or partner it? So the technologies we're talking about this afternoon, will they replace the technologies that are typically used today, or is it the next is it the next partner to that technology? Mariah, Peter?
Okay. Well, I think as always, they will not fully replace, they will converge. So, I mean, using technologies like virtual mirroring, like raising awareness, it leads to a new corporate values, which basically means it's a dichotomy of, is it an ethical behavior or is it the laws that we need? And the answer is both. And in that sense, it's the carrot and the stick. And we are more providing the carrot, and the old technologies were more the stick. And sadly, human nature being what it is, you need to combine the two.
Thanks, Peter. Mariah, anything you'd like to add, or?
I think I would agree. I even it's an in addition to it. So the focus on, from a very behavioral scientific focus is very unique. I would say the surveillance and monitoring that is done up until now, I think I would say is also focused on much more a harder side of the organization trying to grasp information and data. So it's in addition, and I think the behavioral scientific angle has, the potential of the forward looking and being proactive, I think is a very powerful one. So I assume, it becomes more and more insight and attractive for organizations.
I mean, for what it's worth, that my view is that it's a combination of the two, which for a lot of senior leadership, that starts raising questions around: do I have to find yet another budget? My view is that with very effective surveillance technology combined with strong behavioural analytics capability, there's other stuff that typically happens in organisations that you can stop, and the organisation will be in a better position to understand where it's going. I've got a question, and happy for either of you to take this, or Harry's still online, and given that he's in Australia, it might be a good idea if he answered the question so he can keep awake. But the question, it's an interesting question. Is it possible that behavioural data science, and we've touched on this somewhat, can unintentionally impact employees as companies and managers will be looking for specific mindset in staff? Could this go against the diversity discussions to accept people with different culture?
Well, actually, it's a really good question.
Interesting reaction, and I think it's something worth discussing. So, Harry, I think you were going to speak.
That's a really good question, and my answer is actually we use our technology to understand where there is diversity and, more importantly, inclusion. So this technology can be used to actually enhance diversity and inclusion rather than marginalize it. So especially when looking at now this hybrid workplace of remote working and on-site working, this technology is perfectly suited to understand, well, are we being inclusive in the way we're working when we can't see each other face to face? And so, my answer is sure. There's always a risk of homogenizing, sort of, or labeling people based on technology. But if used the right way, this could actually improve the diversity and inclusion in the workplace.
May I add to that, Harry and Rupert? Because there, as a geek and tech person, there is those famous AI misbehavior incidents of face recognition being very bad in recognizing minority faces, for example, and misjudging gender and so on among Africans or other minorities. And what this basically tells us is that we need to know what we are doing. And there is a tendency to trust a computer more than the human being. And we have to be very careful. And that's what I always do in my courses, to train the students: don't trust AI blindly, but know what you are doing. And I think that's the key. And that's why we need to be transparent in what we are doing.
Thanks, Peter. One question I'd like to get to just quickly, and I'm so conscious that we're getting to the end of the session. Peter, one for you, because I can imagine that's something that's talked about a lot in your academic circles. Where does this all end up? Where do we see the future?
Okay, well, it's a huge question, and you have people like Elon Musk, who thinks that AI might decide that humans are unnecessary, and they will just take over and run the world and dispose of the humans. Now, I'm an optimist. I don't think we will be getting there, but it will just make our lives better. And to give you an example, look at Google Maps. Right now, you think it's so easy to navigate at any place on the world. Well, not the Mongolian desert, because there is no Google Maps. Then I'm totally lost. Happened to me. I was at the wedding there, and there was no Google Maps, and I couldn't read Baidu Maps. But it's basically part of my brain. Google Maps is being added to me, and I think it's part of my daily life. And what we are providing here with our technology is Google Maps for social landscapes. It will become part of our brain. It will help me to navigate. It will tell me whether Rupert is annoyed, bored, upset, surprised, kicks me out. Same for Maria. And I will just think it's me that is doing that. But it's basically not changing my brain, but it's augmenting my intellect. And I think that's where we are headed.
Thanks, Peter. Maurice, we're just about out of time, and I think you wanted to make some closing remarks.
I'd just like to thank you all for a very interesting conversation. I think what we've seen over the last 2.5, 3 days is it's really that we're starting to present to the community the art of the possible, or what additional tools are being put into their armory to help the CEO and the CES community and their colleagues start to move the agenda forward in relation to looking at actually how to address and nurture and develop culture and positivity and purpose. I think the interesting thing about technologies like this and behavioral science is it's really important to remember that this isn't just the stick. It's not about sort of preventative measures. It's not just about finding the group of individuals or the individual that is looking at malpractice or poor judgment. It also enables you to look at good practice, good pockets of innovation. And that sort of starts to help actually pivot the attention in relation to the commercial case for the investment in these technologies and this science. I think it's too easy to actually say, oh, is this just an intellectual form of surveillance that is just another thing that's going to help us catch the thief sort of thing. But it's not. And I think that's what's come over. And I think how to position that when you take this into the conversation is very important from the first point of contact with whoever you're talking to is putting it on the front foot in relation to, it's almost like the byproduct is that you can actually identify poor behavior and catch the individual, whether it's poor judgment or malice aforethought. But actually the leading foot is actually this can help nurture and develop your business and reinforce success, if we can use the Russian maxim. It's interesting that if you look at Formula One, when Ferrari had their period of competitive advantage, they were untouchable for about 7-8 years. All they did was focus on the best lap. They never analyzed the bad laps. They always looked at why was that lap better than any other? And that's, if you take that context to behavioral science instead of why is this person bad or why is this group bad, it's almost like, well, why is this group or this individual exceptional? And how can we replicate that? And I think that will pivot the attention to the art of the possible and make building the business case, for example, a lot easier. One of the things the questions came through was that how can you build the business case apart from turning and saying, well, the regulator will like it, which is no bad thing in relation to any business case. But actually, I think the commercial case for these investments and slightly redefining the role of the COO and the Chief Control Officer to make it more of a commercial role to the benefit of the organization rather than just inward looking, backward looking. That's what these 3 days have taught me. It's created a landscape of opportunity and advancement. That's really what my summary points are. Fortunately, I'm not going to leave you time to actually say whether I'm right or wrong on that. So
you're right.
I'm right. Blimey, I'm glad this is on podcast. I've actually got that recorded, Rupert. It's taken me 10 years for you to say that. So I would like to thank all of you for your contributions, particularly the view from ING, which is the Dutch are well-renowned worldwide for leading thought leadership in this space and the application and embracing the art of the possible. I think it's very important for us to follow the leaders on very good occasions. And Peter, thank you for your intellectual input. Harry, thank you for You can, I know you've actually got your Rupert the Bear pajamas on below the screen because it's pretty early. Last thing is, we were hoping to give time for Rupert to sing us out with his guitars in the background, but unfortunately I've talked too much. So thank you all very much. Thank you those listening. Any further questions, please send them in. I can pass them on to the panel and they will come back to you. We've got 3 to go today. I'm hoping you can join us. Thank you. Go to bed. Go to bed, Harry. Thanks.